Well, welcome everyone. I don't know how close to hold the mic, but usually it's closer than one thinks, so I'm going to hold it right up here. I'm David Kirkpatrick. I'm a journalist. Welcome to this session, which is going to be a very rich conversation about a number of things. AI is at the center, but we're really talking about partnerships, the role of partnerships. We're talking about adaptation and resilience, and a variety of ways that organizations, particularly working together, can respond to this dire climate emergency we're all living through. I think one of the takeaways I have from COP so far, and I'm a journalist, like I said, but is that unfortunately, it's almost even worse than we all thought, where we're really at right now. And if we're going to meet any of these extremely ambitious targets, we're going to have to change things that may not be that easy to change. Meanwhile, horrible things are happening to the weather and to society as a result. And that's very much what we're talking about today in terms of how we respond to that. So I want to thank Microsoft and a number of other organizations that have come together to put this session together. In the sense that we're talking about AI here, we're really talking about more than just the hot button of the moment, generative AI. AI is a much more wide-ranging field than you might think if you read the news about OpenAI, et cetera. And I'm curious whether there's a role for generative AI in this, but we may have time to get to that, but we don't really have to because that's not the main thing we're talking about. I know one of the key outcomes from this conversation, I hope you'll all feel when you leave, is I want to work with those people, because this is an amazing group of organizations that have come together to do something extremely important that has a lot of long-term implications and ramifications and could be extended in a variety of different ways. And many of those ways would require even additional partners that may not yet exist. So that's pretty much all I have to say to open things up. Rather than try to introduce the panelists myself, and one of them we hope will arrive momentarily, I'd like each of them to just briefly say who they are. Let's start at that end with Andrew Zolli. Andrew, tell us who you are, what your organization does. And don't get into the topic at hand. Oh.
Hey, everybody. I have to say it's so great to see a full house for this session. So really, thanks for coming. I'm Andrew Zolli. I'm the Chief Impact Officer of an organization called Planet. We're best known for having designed, built, and operating the largest constellation of satellites that observe the Earth in a giant ring around the Earth. Every day, we image the entire planet down to a few meters. So we're collecting information about a changing planet as fast as the planet is changing. And we're really excited about the collaborations you're going to hear about today.
Thank you, Andrew. Chris.
Yeah, hi, I'm Chris Murray. I am one of the three partners here. I'm the director of the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. We're in Seattle.
Hold it even closer.
And we do a lot of measurement of health around the world and also measurement of basic demography, population, mortality, fertility, and excited to be part of this partnership, trying to figure out where people are and what the risks they experience.
Thank you, Chris. And for those who don't know, he is a world-famous health statistician. And in fact, during the crisis of COVID, his data was used by almost every government and widely referred to, even under his name. So he's an important dude. Please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Loretta Girardet. I am the chief of the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction's technical division. And under this work, we are now co-leading the Early Warnings for All initiative. Concretely, I co-lead the interpillar technical work, and I'm also responsible for Pillar 1, which is the pillar responsible for risk knowledge, which is very much the foundation of early warning systems. So, pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Early Warnings for All being a major UN initiative to help people respond, in particular, to climate change and the disasters that result. So, Juan, introduce yourself and tell us what we're doing here.
So, I'm Juan Lavista. I'm Microsoft Chief Data Scientist and also lead our Microsoft AI for Good Lab. This is a complete philanthropic effort that Microsoft has, where we work with organizations and partners like the ones that you see in the panel. And what we bring to the table is our AI and data science expertise. And our objective is to use our expertise to help organizations that are working to try to solve some of these world's greatest challenges by providing AI in the hope that we can make an impact and we can make a change through our partners. So,
okay, but go into a little more detail about what is this group representing? What is the nature of the work you're all doing together?
So, part of a big assumption we have, an assumption I used also had, was that we know, because we live in the 21st century, we know where people live. And understanding where people live is a fundamental building block, whether it's disaster response, disaster preparedness, understanding logistics, understanding how much services you have. You need to understand where people live. And if you happen to live in the global north, in a city in the global north, you can go online and look at the very up-to-date maps. You can look at up-to-date pictures of your house. And we have this illusion that that's the case across the entire world. But majority of that data, I would say all of the data that you see online, depends on very high-resolution satellite data. And that very high-resolution satellite data, these are satellites that are not taking pictures in every single point of the world. They are being tasked to take those pictures. And countries and cities and areas that usually are in the global north, usually there is a commercial reason why you should task these satellites. And that's why majority of the data in the global north is up to date. But in the global south, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, that's not the case. And when you look at a lot of the maps that are in sub-Saharan Africa or in other areas in global south, some of these data either doesn't exist or can be 10 to 15 years old. And we learned that first, like the first time that I saw the impact of that information in production happened like almost a month ago when the last earthquake in Afghanistan, where majority of the houses that were affected by the earthquake were not in any map. And if you don't know where people live, there's no way you can help those people. Those people are invisible to you. And that's how we started this project, working in collaboration with IHME and Planet. Planet, like Andrew, will likely go much more into detail of that. But they are the only company that actually is taking a picture of every single point on Earth every single day. And thanks to AI, we can use AI on top of that data to build what will be the first up-to-date map of population density across the entire world. And for us, it's really important to work with organizations like UNDRR or being part of the early warning for all, because our success is for organizations across the world to use that data. So that's roughly.
Okay, maybe we should go to Andrew to talk a little bit about the satellite data and what its role is in this project.
So thanks, David. I want you to imagine for a moment, first of all, just two quick questions. How many aerospace engineers are in the room? Okay, good to know. And also, how many astronauts? Okay, so for those of you who don't have a background in this particular branch of the technology, I want you to imagine you were looking at a picture of the Earth, you were just like we see on our phones, that kind of thing, like a picture of the Earth. And let's say that you just made it 2 pixels. Okay, just you cut it in half and you made 2 dots. Wouldn't be very helpful. If you cut it again into 4 dots, it wouldn't be very helpful, but it'd be slightly more helpful. Cut it again, cut it again, cut it again, cut it again. One of the things that happens is as you increase the spatial resolution, what happens is you find more stuff and the data becomes more valuable. So there's one part of imaging the planet which is about the spatial resolution. That's critically important. So our satellites image the entire planet every day at a resolution of about 3 meters per pixel. So we're not reading anybody's newspapers, we're not spying on people, but it's enough to see every road, building, tree crown, those kinds of the features of the Earth. Now, there's a second dimension of satellite imagery, and that's not its spatial resolution, but its temporal resolution. If you just went by with your satellites, say, once every year, you would capture change that was fairly slow, and really, it mostly in the rearview mirror. You'd know what happened some time ago. But our satellites are designed to image the entire planet every day. And the way they work is, normally satellites that look at the Earth are the size of school buses, and they're very expensive. Our organization leveraged the technologies that are in these things to build really small satellites, but to build hundreds of them in a giant ring around the Earth. So if you can imagine that my friend Allison is the sun, here's the Earth, it's spinning around on a daily basis. This is hundreds of satellites that spin from the North Pole to the South Pole. And as the Earth turns sideways underneath them, they line scan the planet every day. And that's really important because like when there's a disruption or a disaster, it's really important to know, what did the system look like right before, not years before. It's also important for baselining risk that we actually map and understand where all the humans are, and where all the assets that are at risk that might be affected by climate disruption or public health challenges or food insecurity. You can go right down the list. It's really a foundational piece. And for one of the things I find really interesting, I'll just say this at the end, is that in the global north, we have a politics that is often about privacy. It's dominated by arguments about, how can I make sure that you don't know too much about me? In many other places of the world, the politics are about inclusion. If I'm not on the map, you can't help me. Or I don't get access to resources or services. I can't demand action by my government or by other actors who might help me. So by bringing people onto the map and helping us understand risk and then monitoring those risks for change, those are things that at a global scale you really only can do with satellites. And the good news is we now have a really breakthrough capability, and it's all about plugging it in this way.
Great, thank you. One thing that I probably should have made even more clear at the beginning is, one of the central problems that this group is coming together to try to address is related to climate-driven migration. In order to understand, as things get worse, where are the people now and where might they go? And believe it or not, that's not easy to figure out. And just to gloss a little bit on what Andrew said, yes, PlanetSearch photographs the entire planet every day at a pretty high resolution, but not a high enough resolution just by looking at the pictures to figure out what everything is. That's where AI comes into play. Do you want to talk a little bit about the role of AI, Lori, or do you want to do that?
Sure. Maybe just to take a step back for a moment, right? Because we have been talking a lot about AI in the context of early warning systems. Where we're quite interested in the Office of Risk Reduction is, how can AI help us reduce risk? Once you are at an early warning stage, the impact is imminent, right? So what we're really interested in is understanding the use of AI for that risk equation. The risk equation is understanding the hazards. How are the hazards evolving? And we know climate change is resulting in more frequent, but also more unpredictable events. We do have a system in 110 countries of disaster loss tracking, which means that we're trying to really capture the impact of every disaster event, but we are struggling to analyze that data. We are also struggling to capture the impact of climate change at a localized level, because what we're actually seeing is high frequency but low intensity events that are not actually captured by any database, but it's the cumulative impact that is actually driving up some of the challenges we see around, for example, the socioeconomic well-being of communities, frequent floods, road closure, mudslides, these sorts of things. So really helping countries be able to better analyze what's happening, understand the losses and damages that are occurring, and then link to that some of the predictive analysis that's required. Looking not only at the past historical trends of data, but trying to compile also some of the climate change projections downscale to a local level, so that countries begin to understand in advance what are the likely disasters that are going to occur, and what preventative measures can we put in place to avert and minimize potential losses and damages. So this is where we are really excited to see how can AI help us. But there are a couple of issues that we feel need to be looked at. One is the quality of the data overall. In many of the countries where we're working, I mentioned that we have 110 countries using disaster loss tracking systems. The overall quality of the data is pretty patchy. It's not disaggregated by sex and age, which means that we're not able to understand in advance which portions of the populations are going to be most impacted. It doesn't often include disaggregation by disability, for example, which is so critical for disasters, et cetera. So we need to work on the quality of the data as really an essential component of any work that we would do on AI, I would say. And the other issue that we're seeing a lot is that our partners in the Global South are excited about the potential of AI, but they want capacity strengthening. They don't want to live in a world where AI is benefiting the global north and the wealthier countries, and they are at risk of being left behind. And so looking at how can these innovations be brought to the global south, and how can they use this type of technology that's being developed here, I think is of critical interest to us. I was in a panel yesterday in which I heard that 84% of communities in the global south felt that they did not have access to quality data to inform decision-making, urban planning, localized resilience planning. So we don't want to see a gap grow. We want to close that gap, and I'd love to see how perhaps, events like the one we're having today can think about that when we think about the potential use of AI to support risk reduction and early warning systems. Thank you.
One or two things. So isn't it true that sometimes when terrible disasters, often caused by climate change, happen in parts of the world that are less affluent, which have not been properly mapped, after a disaster, you don't always even know what it looked like before at the aggregate level. And that's a problem when you're trying to figure out how to respond, right?
Well, for us, it's crucial because the worst scenario is that you build back in the same way that you existed prior to the disaster. So understanding where was the planning, for example, along a river and basin that recurrently floods, understanding the dynamics behind that will allow us to build back better, what we call build back better. And what that essentially means is that you build back after disaster in a manner that allows you not to incur the same losses and damages the next time around. And unfortunately, in many countries in the world, and I'm thinking of several in my head right now, it's the same disasters every year that's hitting the same populations that are living in the same locations. And so we're actually creating a spiral rather than resolving the issue at hand. And so understanding what, where do those populations live and what are the dynamics of the hazards that keeps hitting them is critically important. But again, it's about making sure that the local authorities, the national authorities can use that information to drive their urban planning, their decisions on policies that I think might be a gap that we need to look a little bit closer at.
Really good, really good. So Chris, you have this extraordinary database of health information. I assume that kind of your big project is figuring out new ways to apply that data for decision makers, planning, strategy, for all kinds of entities, governmental and otherwise. And just tell us what you're doing with these people and how you think about the role of your work here.
So we run a thing called the Global Burden of Disease Study, which is a collaboration of 10,500 analysts, researchers in almost every country, trying to document every major disease and risk factor in the past up to the present. And then what we're adding to that lens is forecasts into the future, including the impacts of climate and other risks, pandemics, you can name it. And so this sort of project where we work with Microsoft and Planet to figure out where people are, puts us in a position to answer questions, for example, where will people, we have a map behind us of Kenya, and we've done this using CMIP6 forecasts of climate, where is it likely that people are living in places that will be so heat stressed, so climate stressed, that they will either have to move or suffer malnutrition? And so
This is the early warning element, in effect. Figure out where the risks are.
Very early, in the sense that we're looking way into the future. And so we can, we've done this for Kenya. We will do it for the whole world as this project moves along. And what you see is that there are places that will become essentially uninhabitable. And either there's probably 9 million people in Kenya that will have to move at some point, or those that stay, which is probably 10, 15% will be at very high rates of malnutrition that we can see in the data already. So you can start to piece together this sort of micro view of where people are and what are the risks with what we know is coming on the climate front to sort of say who's going to be at very high risk, whether if they stay or if they're going to really have to move into other environments.
So even that 9 million figure of the people in Kenya who will probably have to move is a result of this work. You figured that out. So that's the kind of thing that you're going to work at in more and more granular detail on a more and more global basis?
Yeah, I mean, I think Juan was saying we're planning to go global soon on this project, and so we will leverage the true power of Planet's satellite imagery to figure out where people are and then do these add-on analyses where we can relate it to climate change. Essentially there's a human niche where humans are able to live, which is characterized by temperature and rainfall and access to water. And you can start to say, where will humans be stuck in places that they have historically not been able to live in? And then it's likely they'll have to move.
Okay, Andrew, you want to jump in?
I just want to tie a couple of things together about being able to understand where people are and being able to run that analysis on a daily and weekly basis. So the first thing is that, remember, we want to be able to measure and understand changes, like changes in human population concentrations, down to a few meters, really matters, say, when a disruption causes the creation of a new refugee camp. So if there you have rapid human shifts, you have the resettlements of people into temporary and often sort of permanently temporary informal settlements. And if you want to understand how much food aid do you want to deliver or is needed to be delivered into those contexts, or public health support, or what the other compounding risks, the kind of risks that Chris and his colleagues are world-class experts in understanding, we can run those analyses as fast as the changes are happening. So that's a really interesting issue. There's a sort of baselining issue to do what Chris is saying, looking way into the future around the kind of human niche and where human beings are living, and being able to help avoid potentially, like to say, okay, there's so many people here at risk here, we really have to take some significant climate adaptation, mitigation, and resilience activities to help stave off that issue. But also being able to respond to really rapidly moving events is going to be critical too. And the same data set, the same capability helps you in both dimensions.
Okay, Juan, first of all, since Vanessa has unfortunately gotten caught up somewhere, could you just talk briefly about the ITU's role in this collaboration and why the ITU is involved?
So ITU, part of the early warning for all, and likely Lori has a much better answer than me, but a fundamental piece of early warning for all is once there is a disaster, you need to communicate this disaster. People need to find out. So part of the work that we are doing with ITU is to use our Microsoft infrastructure data to try to measure where do people have connectivity. And with this data also using our base maps, like using our population maps, like we know that people live here. If we don't see any reception, any cell reception or any internet connectivity here, that population is not connected to the network. Like there's no way that you can communicate to that population if in the event of a natural disaster. So that's how we collaborate with ITU, and I don't know if Lori wants to say.
Yeah, maybe just a few words. Vanessa is the lead of Pillar 3 and a close colleague, so I feel like I can speak on her behalf a little bit. We do recognize very much the potential of artificial intelligence to the extent that the Interpillar Technical Group has established an AI sub-working group for early warnings for all. The Early Warnings for All, for those of you who are not aware, is an initiative to protect all people on the planet by early warning systems in the next 5 years. And the reason for this is because it's one of the most cost-effective adaptation measures to put in place. Countries that have early warning systems see tremendous decreases in the number of people who lose their lives or their livelihoods. So it's a really worthwhile investment. This AI working group is looking at a couple of different issues. So how can AI be applied across all the pillars? So we've heard about risk communication. This is really about understanding in advance how to reach people with a warning before a disaster strikes. But also for risk knowledge, the pillar that I lead, we're looking at predictive analytics, we're looking at exposure mapping, vulnerability mapping, understanding also resilient infrastructure, there are many different applications that are possible, as well as the forecast, improving forecast. And we have good examples of where AI is being used. So we're very excited by this, and I might just mention, Juan hasn't mentioned, that it's not just talk. We're actually walking the walk. We're going to Ethiopia immediately after the COP. And here we are starting to look at how the exposure mapping and population mapping of Microsoft can help Ethiopia improve its early warning system. And it's interesting because Ethiopia has put in place a system of risk profiles down at the Loretta level. This is at the sub-district level. So really trying to understand vulnerability, exposure, and hazards at the most local level. It's a huge country, huge population. But they have invited Microsoft there because they do understand that the potential to really better understand the population movements and patterns in the country is core to the early warning work. So this is a very exciting opportunity for us, and we hope that the Ethiopia example will then trigger the ability for us to expand this to many other countries. And there's a huge interest, I know, because I've been dealing with these countries. But as I mentioned, they don't just want the technology, they want the training, they want the capacity development. And so I think what we need to think a little bit about is how can we bring this institutional strengthening, capacity strengthening to these countries so that they themselves can, work on these technological advances.
Thank you. I've actually worked with ITU quite a bit in recent years on some other things. And another big project they have, which they do in partnership with Ericsson and others, is to try to create connectivity to every elementary school in the world. But believe it or not, the first several years of that project have been devoted exclusively to identifying where the schools are. It's that basic. Even schools, we don't really know. There's no place you can go. You can't just look it up on Bing, right? So I want Juan, you to talk a little bit, and then I want to go to Chris, but I want you to talk about the role of AI. We've got these photos from Planet come in every day. What do you do with them? And talk any way you want about the role of AI in this whole project.
Yeah, so we have to understand that once you have at the resolution that Andrew was mentioning, 3-meter resolution, it would take a human 400 years to go through every single picture that is taken every single day. So every single day you have enough pictures that would take a human 400 years to just look at the picture for a couple of seconds. So the magnitude of data is just too big for us to work. But if you have an AI model that does that, we can do the same in a couple of hours. So that's basically the role of AI here. Because yes, you could potentially have humans doing that and doing the mapping. As humans, we've been doing mapping for centuries now. But at this scale and at this speed, it would just be impossible for us to do. So the role of AI here is to look at these pictures and try to differentiate between human structures, and that could be any human structures, and basically just land. And once we have these models that require also a lot of humans, like we need to label data, we work together with AI, labeling the data, and helping these models understand what is a human structure. Once we have that, we can feed this data, and that's something that we share to Chris and his team. And then there's a whole idea of population on top of that, because a structure in Kenya does not have enough the same population distribution as a structure in the US or in Europe. And that's a lot of the expertise that Chris and his team has for now decades doing in many ways on trying to use this data. And that's why this is a collaboration between us, Planet, and HME, because we need the expertise of all the teams working together.
Well, I know also one thing that you work to figure out is what are the materials the house is made out of? Because if you don't know that, you can't figure out how vulnerable it is to certain kinds of disasters, right?
Correct. That's a project that we have been doing now in India. Is the structure of a house is a very good indicator of heat waves. So in order for us to help population be more prepared for heat waves, the first project that we have is to identify certain type of structures that will be more affected by heat waves. Heat waves today kill in India roughly 80,000 people a year. And in the event of an increase of 1.5 Celsius, these numbers could go up to the almost million people, basically. So clearly for India and for multiple countries suffering from heat waves, this is a fundamental problem. And what we provide to those organizations on the ground is a map of map every single building and understand the materials that those buildings are used. Another project that we have that is more on the disaster response, and this is more tied to Lori's and her team, is when there is a natural disaster, the time plays a fundamental component, correct? So you need to have people on the ground, and you need to understand how many people you send on the ground and what are the logistics that can help you. Having an understanding of every single building that was affected and having maps that are up to date that shows what was the effect of that natural disaster, whether it's an earthquake or a wildfire or a flooding, how many houses were affected, where are those houses? If you can get that information within 24 hours, that information can help save lives. And that's one of the projects that we have, is to try to have a damage assessment that before were done by humans, try to do as fast as possible, download the data from satellites. The first part is actually Planet and actually tasking the satellites, putting the satellites on top of the natural disaster, taking pictures, and then running AI on top of that to provide that information that is updated maps to people on the ground.
Sometimes that can be done effectively in real time then in order to respond to something that just happened that we didn't know was going to happen there, and you've got the photos already and you can apply some AI to it.
Correct, and we're trying to streamline as fast as possible the pipeline so we can get that information, that is updated maps, like damage maps, to people on the ground as fast as possible.
Great. Okay, Chris, I want you to talk about two things, and really anything you want to add that would help the audience understand what's going on here and what the possibilities are. But how does your data intersect with the photos and the AI, et cetera? And so specifically for this project, but I also would like you to talk about what kind of uses you envision for your data going forward as these kinds of capabilities evolve.
So let's start with the first part. We've got the satellite data coming in from Planet. We've got the really clever analytics that Juan's team gives us a map of human structures. So for every 30 meters square on planet Earth, we will know, and this is being done for, as you can see behind us, for Kenya as a test case. What coverage is of human structures in that. Now, in the north of Kenya, or here along the Tana River, the number of people in a human structure is a lot less than in the slums of Nairobi. And so the part that we bring to the analysis is figuring out from all the data sources that are there, census data, household survey data, how many people are likely in each type of structure, so that we can then place, go from a map of buildings and human structures to the number of people in different places, which is important for disaster relief, for any sort of planning, and also important for sort of risk stratification. So that's the sort of bringing the demographic data sources to bear, and there's a bunch of techniques, all in the statistical range that help us figure out people per structure. And then The vision here, I think, is, think of the layers of here's where people are, and then there are many types of risks that we know with more or less precision. So air pollution, we can figure out from satellites. So we have a pretty good idea about, or quite a precise idea about ambient air pollution. And we know that that's a major risk factor today, right? We don't have to go into the future to know that, about 4 million people are dying from ambient air pollution in the world each year. But we can now sort of, combining those two types of sources, you can say where is the attributable risk to air pollution? And you can also start to do that for a number of other risks where there's enough information, whether it's from surveys or other sources, where we can get a pretty good map of risk exposure. So you put the two together, you can start to say who's vulnerable and who's suffering from different types of risks, whether it's malnutrition, poor water supply, sanitation, air pollution, a long list of risks that you can start to put together this super fine-grained understanding of where people are and the risks that they're suffering.
Yeah. Did you want to add something, Andrew?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really extraordinary here is that what I'm always reminded of is the ways in which transparency drives accountability. When you understand who is at risk and what they are at risk, what their exposures are, that's the beginning of institutions taking accountability. It's the beginning of political will. It's the beginning of climate action, we hope. I did want to just add one additional thing to the story of how AI plugs into this work, which is the work thus far led by Juan and Chris's teams on the analysis, the successive layers of analysis that come out of the satellite imagery are critically important. You can't see it here because we're looking at the whole country, but this is a map that goes down to 30 meters. So we're not interested in who is in each block. We just want to know estimates of exactly where people are. But I want to pick up on Loretta's point. Loretta, you've repeatedly and rightfully pointed out that we need people who can use this data. You've raised the capacity question. And there I think AI is also going to have a transformational impact. I mean, if you haven't gone and played with Bing's AI, it's sort of like I'm going to use the ChatGPT example, but it's like that. It's the kind of thing where you can begin to ask questions, really sophisticated questions, in plain language, and not just in English, but in many different languages. When tools like this, these maps of exposure, when you can begin to query them in plain language and say, how many people in this place, right? Then not only your mom, but your minister can do that. You know what I mean? That's a transformational moment.
So generative AI comes in this kind of an architecture for the use of the data more than for the assembly of the data.
Yeah, and
or
I would say
possibly both.
I would say what's really interesting about that in particular is that no one asks about how much capacity we need to use generative AI because it's a bar where you ask questions in English. It's a little bit like a search bar. I mean, we're not. The whole point is that it's bringing the value, it's enlivening the value of the data, it's making it relevant and making it accessible. And I think it will address some, not all, but it will certainly address some of Loretta's rightful concerns.
Okay, and I want to come to you in a second, but I wanted to make a general point about AI that this whole thing exemplifies. And before I do, there is one more chair up in front if somebody in the back would like to sit down. Basically, the challenge that AI brings to society is, where do you get the data that the AI works on, right? And what these people are talking about is a very emblematic and still, frankly, early project to get new kinds of data into AI so that we can then ask ChatGPT what's happening in this town, in Kenya, in this weather, or whatever. But the range of data types that are going to eventually need to be incorporated into AI is unlimited. And we are still at an unbelievably primitive early state as a society of humans in figuring out even what all those are. But I'm hoping that's a little bit of a lead up to some of the points you wanted to make about, and I want you to also explain early warning for all and all the different participants that can benefit from that.
Okay, maybe just go to, I wanted to, reflect on something Juan had said, because I remember a few years back being in Asia Pacific, and one of the enormous Asian countries and seeing on a wall every single corner of their country mapped out. In real time, they were able to estimate within an hour the damage that was done using AI in response to any disaster, an earthquake, flood. They had all of the AI models already there. This was China. I mean, it was extraordinary what they were doing a few years ago. And if we could bring that type of capacity to all the countries in the world, it would be amazing. But the point I wanted to make was that they were calculating these costs after the disaster. And what we need is a little bit more thinking about what will it cost before a disaster occurs. And the reason for this is because we are not getting the investment we need in prevention. And I believe that if we could use AI to really tell the story of how much it's going to cost if you do not invest in risk reduction measures, and this population is hit by this disaster, and this is going to be the cost of the humanitarian response, and this is going to be the cost of the reconstruction, we might do a better job of putting a prevention lens into all of this, because we don't have to be sitting here waiting for the impacts of climate change to incur losses and damages. We know that there is a lot of work that could be done to prevent the most severe impacts, and the investment isn't there. So I would really like to see how AI could be brought more to bear on that, and that includes doing cost-benefit analysis scenarios with governments and showing them more specifically on this is what it will cost you if you do not invest now on prevention.
So the warning could be taken several ways that you're working on. On the one hand, you want to be able to tell people who live in an area, you know what, you might want to think about moving, or even in a much more near term, get out, a hurricane is coming or whatever. But I assume you also maybe equally want to speak to policymakers, say, we've figured out these risks exist and we can document them now very clearly. Here's how you need to change policy. Is that fair? Absolutely.
It's the same rivers that are flooding. It's the same, coastal areas that are receiving the same shocks and stresses. So there are it's more unpredictable, that's for sure. But it's not something that we do not know is going to happen. It's recurrent disasters. So what we need is to change the decisions that are being made by governments in terms of how they're managing these risks. And I believe that AI can really play a role in helping to change the mindset and to also change some of the investment decisions that are being made. Because quite frankly, it's not just responding to risk, we are creating new risks every single day by the development decisions that we are making. And so that's why I argue that, yes, of course, early warning, we're behind early warning 100%, but we feel far more needs to go into prevention. And I'd like to see how AI could really be brought to the forefront of that and change some of the policies that are being made.
Very cool.
Yeah, and to add to that, these are not things that are difficult to predict, correct? So when you have flood maps, and basically we just cross, like we are doing now that for the event for next week on Ethiopia, where we're looking at we're building flood maps, historical flood maps across Ethiopia, and then you're crossing these with the population. And it's basically as simple as saying, this is the amount of houses that you have that are new houses that are within the flood maps, correct? Like, so if history repeats, and there's a very good likelihood that history will in floods, or it's going to get worse, those people will be affected. And a lot of times, what we have seen, and again, this is people are doing constructions, particularly new constructions, in areas that they don't know that they get flooding. So this is areas that is relatively, there's a lot of low-hanging fruits on areas that you can make a big impact on disaster preparedness, but not trying to do very crazy forecasts. It's just like, hey, let's look at just history. It's as simple as looking at history and crossing history with where people live now using the data we have.
And actually, I think one of the things that's particularly interesting is that the very same instruments we use to map all the populations, we see all kinds of other assets. And I don't want to speak out of my lane of expertise, and I'm not an expert, and I'm standing next to one of the world's experts, sitting next to one of the world's experts. But so maybe I'll ask you to speak to this. But one of the things that we've heard about, we just lived through this incredibly expensive, monumental event called COVID. And, one of the ways in which I know novel illnesses are transmitted from wildlife to humans is along this boundary interface between, say, forests and human settlements. And, one of the things I've heard, we've seen the literature, is that if we want to arrest or slow the rates of transmission of those novel illnesses, is to slow the rates of deforestation. And so you think about like all these other forms of risk, and I thought maybe Chris, you could speak to that since you know vastly more about it than all of us.
I mean, there's a real movement to try to reduce risk of future pandemics by thinking about the various interventions that will reduce human-forest interaction or wild forest. And so, you know, there's quite a strong direction. If you think about pandemic preparedness, you want to be early warning, you know, but you also want to prevent. And that's one of the prevention strategies. So, you know, bringing to bear the forest maps or where population is being, for many reasons, pushed into more interaction will be a powerful tool for that.
I mean, do you want to add something else?
No, just that one of the other canonical things we do with our satellites is we monitor deforestation. We monitor the interface between where humans and wildlands are changing, where that boundary is changing. So the idea is that the thing that's really interesting is how you layer all these things on top of each other. Yeah.
When people ask me, why do I care about climate change, it's because I want human civilization to survive. I mean, it's at that point. But the interesting thing about this kind of work is that as it advances, and I'd like to sort of end by all of you as much as possible talking about where this kind of work could go in future. What we really need to be able to do for the world is much more exactly articulate the consequences of inaction. In other words, if we don't reduce burning fossil fuels, if we don't slow the temperature rise, what's going to happen at the level of your town, your city, your state, your country, maybe even your house? The more we can do that, the more we can compel people to be advocates for climate action now, I would assume. So that's just a general point to tie this all to COP. But I'd love anybody, and particularly Chris and Juan, to talk about where your work is going to go as this stuff advances.
So for us, one thing that Lori mentioned, and I fully agree because we have seen this now over the years, is we need to create capacity to consume the data. And for us, like, and this is the area that I think going to your generative AI aspect, Andrew and I, we started working together the week after the Ukraine-Russia war started. And one of the things that we saw is a lot of the organizations that we were helping had access to the data, but they couldn't consume it. Like they had access that they could go and download the imagery, but it was not even possible for them to visualize the data that was available thanks to Planet. So I think that if you ask me that the long term, it's not enough for us to do these models, it's not enough for us to provide data. We need to make it easy for users to consume it. And that's what I think generative AI and Andrew and I are working what we call the queryable Earth in a way that you can query satellite data just using English or Spanish or Mandarin. And we think that from that perspective, the future is have this this data available for humans to consume in their own language, and make it easy to consume. That's that I think we will continue investing in models. We want to have, like, I want to have that every single big natural disaster we have data maps ideally within 24 hours. We want to have the whole population mapped, and hopefully these data being consumed by organizations to make decisions. But generally, these also need to be tied to an investment to make it easy for users to use the data.
Well, that's a natural segue to you, Chris, because your organization, the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, has a visualization tool on your website that already ingests enormous variables and allows people to just try out what would happen, what is this disease in this region, maybe under these circumstances. I don't know all the different parameters, but presumably that's something that has infinite capacity to get more effective and granular and helpful.
You know, yes, I'm not sure all the pieces that you described are yet there in the sense of this very granular analysis that we're hoping that this fuels. But the basic vision is if you can make available the current assessment of what sort of risks people are exposed to, what's coming, because climate's not the only challenge. It's a fundamental challenge, but there's risks of other pandemics. There's risk of antimicrobial resistance. There's conflict. There's the obesity epidemic. There's many risks that are unfolding that different countries, local governments, individuals need to manage. And it's part of why we put so much emphasis on building this 10,000 plus collaboration, because it's really only where you have both the analytics and the local ownership of them that you're going to see this information being used for decision making. So it's great that that Microsoft and UNDRR is going to Ethiopia, because it's one of the places where we have more than 1,000 collaborators and a very close working relationship with the government, who, by the way, were asking where are people, and they didn't know. And I said, we know, and they want to know as well. So you will get a very fertile audience there. But I think that's the vision. Like, can we make these analytics available, plausible trajectories into the future, so you can understand what's coming and what are the risks and try to balance them, but do that in a way that creates a broad community that can act on it.
So, Lori, where do you hope to see this work evolve? And what are the concerns that you still have, maybe that you haven't had a chance to mention thus far?
Well, I think one of the concerns I have is that we've seen that just because people have the right information doesn't mean they make the right decisions. And that actually it's complex. The models that are available to countries doesn't necessarily generate the type of political responses that are needed. Our leaders live with an optic of short-termism rather than long-termism. So all of this has to be looked at in a broader context. I think that the financial community plays an important role in pushing countries to make the decisions that are necessary to protect the population. So I wouldn't rely just on, providing information to governments necessarily or to politicians. I think it would be important to really ensure this information is reaching a broader spectrum, because we've seen with climate change, it's the activism behind climate change that has really pushed some of the governments to take the right decisions. Getting it to the populations, getting it to the financial sector, to businesses, the ones that are probably going to really make sure that this information is used in a way that will generate the right types of decisions, I believe. Yeah.
I hesitate to say the word, but insurance.
Huge.
Presumably, that industry would love to have this kind of data, and you should have them as part of your group, or maybe you shouldn't, because we might not like the way they use it. But
actually, just for what it's worth, we produce indicators, for instance, of things like how much moisture is in the soil, and at very high resolution. So we can too much moisture and you get landslides, too little and you get crop failures. And that data today is used in 28 countries to deliver insurance to smallholders and pastoralists. It's also used by humanitarian organizations for anticipatory action. Maybe just to answer the question you asked, just sort of thinking about the future, I have two thoughts. The first one, this is like a metaphor for those of you who are not aerospace engineers. When you're building a satellite, in addition to whatever you want the satellite to do, you have to put special instruments on the satellite to measure the forces of change that are acting on the satellite. Otherwise, so you're measuring its behavior continuously, because if you just measured it every 10 minutes or every 30 minutes, the satellite could spin out of orbit and become unrecoverable, right? Well, I have news for everybody. We live on a satellite. It just happens to have, 8 billion fellow astronauts on it. And we need to instrument the planet so that we are measuring the change that's happening as fast as we can, as fast as those changes are unfolding, so that we can sort of course correct. And that really, when you see this is a microcosm of a much larger project. And I think of that project as creating what you might call a kind of moral mirror. a reflection in real time of what humanity is doing and what's happening and our interactions at all of these different scales, domains, risk factors and vectors, et cetera. And that ability to see things that are happening as they're happening and to see where they might happen tomorrow has huge implications for the way institutions operate, the way where we make interventions, how we allocate resources. You know, just yesterday, Al Gore and a guy named Gavin McCormick released this massive inventory, a public data set of some 350 million sources of emissions, very heavily powered by many data sets, but especially by ours. If you have transparency, then you have real negotiations. Then you have the really directed allocation of capital and everything else. That's what's really exciting. That moment is the one that gets me.
A great example of that is these oil companies that are all saying we're going to get rid of our methane. They don't really have a choice because all of a sudden all these satellites are going up and everybody's going to know every single methane leak. So they might as well act now. Yeah. But Juan, I know one of the key points of this whole conversation happening here at COP is to invite other partners to work with Microsoft and the other organizations here. You know, just talk a little bit about, and we've got to wrap, this will have to be the final comment, but what would you like to see in terms of additional partnership?
No, I think for us, what is critical is organizations that are working on the ground with, like particularly in the area of disaster response, using our data to help. Like for us, what is important is to have an impact, but we don't have an impact by just doing data. We have an impact through our partners that use that data to make decisions. That's how we see, and we have the person with the timeout there. So thanks everybody for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all 4 of you, and we're sorry we didn't have Vanessa, but thank you.